I have the honor of introducing Nate Fick, the ambassador, and it's an honor. One of the things that I think we met probably a few months ago. I got to be honest, I've made it about halfway through your book. It's actually good. And it's a great read. A little scary at times, but I think we're in a very interesting place. And what makes me feel like I've literally moved back from Asia 2 years ago. It's my first opportunity to come to DC, and just spending time with Nate and realizing these are the types of people that are now in the United States government that actually are focused on some of the bigger issues. I think the fact that Nate actually was in the military, run a company, has actually been an academic. If you read his book, it's probably one of the better written books I've read in a long time. But also is trying to basically make the U.S. government participate with industry in a series of projects to actually deal with some of the toughest issues around the world, and doing it in a very, very positive and open way. And I think he's been a great partner. Yesterday we had a meeting with the Australian ambassador. And I will tell you, it's been a fantastic breath of fresh air for us to learn. And from afar, coming here to DC, I just want to say, Nate, we're really happy as PTC to have you as a partner, and thank you for joining us to speak today. It's really an honor for us to have you. It's
mutual. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I think just before we get started, I think one of the things is I wanted Nate to just kind of walk us through his new group at the U.S. State Department, because I think this is you're an ambassador at large. Not everyone knows what that means if they're from overseas, but really where your focus is and where you see you're heading with your department and sort of the key initiatives that you're working on.
Yeah, thanks. About 3 years ago, Secretary Blinken and the Congress decided to set up a new technology-focused organization at the State Department in order to integrate and elevate our approach to tech issues and our diplomacy. It was a recognition, really, that tech innovation, leadership in key technology areas is a key source of national power or coalition power and influence. And I'll take that even a step further. The traditional measures of strength that we're all accustomed to, things like GDP and military capacity, more and more are downstream of our ability to lead in key technology areas. And so my office, this role, were created as a recommendation from a bipartisan congressional commission, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, embraced by the last administration, but they weren't able to get it done, and then actually created by this administration.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think it's, what are some of the, obviously, we see you in the Pacific working on the Pacific Fiber project, but I know that's only a small subset of the stuff that keeps you busy every day.
Yeah.
What are the other? Because I know also probably one of the largest cyber conferences, for example, was this week here in Washington, and that's probably the larger part of your job, right?
Yeah. So the world's a busy place right now, obviously, right? I mean, just read the headlines. So my office provides a lot of our tech assistance to Ukraine. I was in Kyiv most recently a couple of weeks ago. We provided something like 30,000 Starlink terminals to Ukraine to allow them to continue to communicate, continue to target and fight. Cyber defense, the Ukrainian government enterprise, the Ukrainian military, big Ukrainian companies, critical infrastructure, energy distribution as winter approaches in Europe. So there's a big shooting war in Europe right now that we need to remember while we're talking about everything else. Obviously, the Middle East is pretty active, and we're involved quite a bit in tech support, cyber defense of our Israeli allies, and then AI governance. I heard your opening comments, Bill, and 2 years ago, ChatGPT and generative AI sprung onto the scene, and every country in the world said we got to do something, and nobody knew what to do.
Yeah.
And so the U.S. has tried to stake out a kind of innovation-first leadership position, and we've been trying to make that the core, some of the core operating principles in the multilateral organizations around the world.
Okay. Well, so I think, so obviously that's some interesting things you got to do on a daily basis, kind of switching gears. But speak specifically about the Pacific, because I think one of the things that you've done, you've worked very closely with the team in Google, and sort of in that, it was one of your first partnerships, I think, with industry, at least that's come into our purview, right? And What was the genesis of that? How did you sort of get involved with that?
Yeah, the initial genesis of that was a phone call that I got from our ambassador in Canberra, Caroline Kennedy, and this is a year and a half ago, 2 years ago almost, and she said, "Hey, Google's doing something really interesting out here, and the Australian government's all over it, and we should really get involved in this." And I mean that call was the genesis, and it's sort of an important message about how really pivotal it can be to have who you have representing the United States on the ground in key places, and the fact that she was attuned to it, she was plugged into it, she recognized its potential, and then it just got a conversational ball rolling. I don't know if Brian Quigley's in the room, but very very quickly got connected with Brian, and we saw this immense opportunity, and all the pieces had come together. Right, you think about what the constituent elements are. There was huge geopolitical significance to this Central and South Pacific connectivity project. We had a willing group of partner countries around the world, around the region, who could provide diplomatic support, but also could provide some funding. There was, something like 25,000 kilometers of cable was already being laid. This is as shovel ready as it got, like the ship was at sea. And the bulk of the project was being done based on market demand. This wasn't government intervention. So there was an opportunity for relatively small amounts of government dollars to be used as leverage to generate what were, for us, outsized geopolitical outcomes. And specifically, that was connecting a bunch of Pacific Island countries, spending a little bit of money to get the branching units in place so we would at least have the optionality to lay the spurs. And just kind of the political narrative on this is worth thinking about for a minute, and then I'll stop, because two things are true with a project like this one. On the one hand, to your opening comments, Bill, there's an incredible inclusive connectivity story that's real and that's important, bringing the 21st century economy and access to the outside world to these fairly remote distributed geographies where there may not be a market imperative alone to make the connection. At the same time, though, make no mistake, we're in a race around the world, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific, to get generational infrastructure in place in competition with the PRC that has a very different vision of a technology future than we have. And so if we didn't do this project now, then they were certainly going to do it soon.
Yeah. What do you think? Do you think this is the beginning of a series of initiatives that you'll do across the planet? Is this just a one-off?
Well, I sure hope so. I mean, I hate successful one-offs. So I think we learned a lot and built a lot of trust, or continue to build a lot of trust in the course of executing this project. You were at the breakfast yesterday with Ambassador Rudd. You've got a former Prime Minister of Australia who's now the Australian ambassador here, and a real academic, has written a couple of good books about China and sees this all very clearly. And so we kind of have the right partners in place here. But we're learning what the constituent ingredients are to make it work in other places. And if we spin the globe and look around the world, there are certainly places in the Indian Ocean, in West Africa, in the North Atlantic, where there's a lot more we could do.
Yeah, no, I think it's we're hopeful that it's a good model, and partly just because I think one of the things is there are 6 million people that will benefit from this. They'll get digital infrastructure for the first time, and it's so that's a fantastic outcome for everyone. I think as you start thinking about AI, because AI starts to become, that'll be a big topic in some of these discussions. I know that's an area that you're starting to think about, but what's the U.S. government's role, you think, in AI? Is it to sort of let industry go do it, or is it to become part of it? And it's interesting when we talk to Vince Cerf, he talks about, will it be an FDA-like regulator of AI, or will it just be allowed, like the internet, to proliferate all over? And so what's your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're all creatures of analogy, looking to history to try to peer into the future.
Yep.
And so you hear all of these analogous kinds of statements. So do we want to set up an IAEA kind of UN-centric like organization? Well, no, probably not. What about an IPCC sort of expert-led organization? Well, that's not perfect either. What about an Atoms for Peace sort of Eisenhower era? Provide the benefits without providing while minimizing the risk of of diffusion and technology leakage. But that's an imperfect analogy too. So I think actually, we're going to have to do the hard thing of creating new ideas. And the sort of basic approach, fundamentally, that the U.S. government is trying to take goes back to my original point that tech innovation and our leadership position in core technologies is the ultimate source of our strength, or one of the ultimate sources of our strength. And so it would be a big mistake for the U.S. to follow a generally European approach on this and over-regulate at the outset and constrain our innovative capacity, because then we're going to lose. And so it has to be a fairly light touch as a North Star. At the same time, the destructive power and the risks of the technology are significant in everything from security to cybersecurity to sort of you name it. Forget about the labor market disruptions and the equity issues and all the other legitimate concerns. Just in the national security sense, there are some real issues. So what we've tried to do is bring the leading companies together to articulate and sign on to a set of voluntary commitments governing how they develop frontier models, how they secure them, how they use them. And those voluntary commitments are important for two reasons. Voluntary means voluntary. It doesn't constrain innovation. Voluntary also means fast, so we don't go down the EU AI Act sort of multi-year regulatory swirl path. We've taken the voluntary commitments and ported them into the international system. They became the DNA for an international code of conduct for AI developers at the G7. And now in the year ahead, we're going to push that out to more and more countries, more and more companies. And an AI Safety Institute has been established inside NIST at the Commerce Department. So a lot of this, where the rubber meets the road, as in any technology, it's in the standard setting. And so we're going to try to bake the U.S. approach in at the beginning to the international standards organizations.
Yeah, I guess we're sort of fortunate that many of the leading companies are U.S. based, right? Which is
something like 86% of the market cap in AI is So yes, but we better not squander that. We shouldn't assume we can always have that.
Well, I think so. But how do you? So one of the tougher issues as we talk about is, so obviously China is pushing in that direction. The Russians are heading in that direction as well. How do you bring them into the fold, and how do you bring or do you not, or you just sort of say it is what it is?
Look, I would separate Russia and China and just a few words on each. So, Russia is currently waging an unprovoked war of aggression on the European continent, and is pretty rapidly establishing itself as a pariah state. And the United States has made its objective to ensure that Russia's further invasion of Ukraine results in a strategic defeat for Russia. So let's put that aside for a second. And China is a much more relevant conversation when it comes to AI. And I think a few things are true and need to be true all in parallel. I talked about how we're trying to establish kind of the U.S. metaphorical operating system, one of openness and innovation and multi-stakeholderism and engagement with companies and civil society. Establish that as the dominant operating system as we set up kind of global governance approaches. So that's one track, but there are at least two other tracks that matter. We are engaged with the Chinese bilaterally in conversations about AI, because we got to coexist. I went to China a few months ago with Secretary Blinken and spent 5 hours with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and a lot of the conversation was about this. And a little anthropological observation from somebody who's new to the State Department. At all of our embassies around the world, everybody wears a lanyard with their security badge on it. And they tend to customize the lanyard by embassy. They design it themselves. The one in China has a US flag and a Chinese flag, and it says on it, the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. That almost sounds Chinese, I think that I find it really interesting to see how our people on the ground think about the work that they're engaged in. So it is the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. So much of the economic and military and social future of the planet depends upon the U.S. and China finding a way to coexist. And so we have to have a bilateral dialogue with the Chinese on AI. The third track is you got most of the world's population with no near-term hope of domestic development of frontier AI. and a very little ability to even to buy it. And so at the UN General Assembly in a couple of weeks, we're going to be focused on how do we bring the benefits of AI to the rest of the world? How do you close the digital divide in AI in areas that are of global interests, like medical diagnostics and agricultural productivity and climate modeling and all these other things?
Yeah, no, I think it's, as we started thinking about the digital, and we'll talk about it later today, but tomorrow, but it is a reality because I mean, just to deploy one of these models is billions of dollars, right? I mean, you're talking about this. This isn't small little put a website on the internet anymore. It's it's a massive project. Talk to me about all of us saw the Microsoft's security glitch that happened a few weeks ago, and I think it scared a lot of people. I think into sort of thinking about, do we have cybersecurity? Is our critical infrastructure at risk? And I think one of the things that when you and I first met, you talk a lot about that. That's what keeps you up at night, right? Which is, are our submarine cables, our power plants, are they safe? And where do you think we are? Because I know, obviously there was September 11th, there was a big overreaction, and you had sort of Homeland Security started. Are we going to have like a Homeland Security for cyber and sort of looking at all these issues? Because I think it is becoming very, very apparent that things can happen, right?
Yeah, I think first of all, just to be clear, the CrowdStrike Microsoft issue, CrowdStrike released a press release that said that it was a misconfigured patch. It pushed out to their Falcon endpoint detection platform. The company that I built was also an endpoint detection company. So I will just say personally, I was at an airport and I sent a picture of one of the blue screens of death to one of the CrowdStrike founders and got a very choice 2-word response from him. But so I have no reason to believe that was anything other than a misconfiguration.
No, I agree. But more, I think it highlighted what happens when something happens, right?
I mean, look, we're all more and more dependent on digital connectivity of all kinds, and it's a double-edged sword. We get convenience, we get cost savings, we get all kinds of benefits, but we also get exposure. We get risk. When my wife and I built a house, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, and the contractor came to me and said, "This is the most analog house we've ever built." And I said, "Let me tell you what I do for a living." And so I do think that we all are going to have to contend with that. And there are going to be some interesting, almost philosophical choices we're going to have to make about whether to connect things just because we can. I think there's a valid debate to have about whether our voting should be digital or whether, in fact, it should be analog. And we should all collectively, as a society, say, I'm okay waiting a day or two for results if I'm going to have higher fidelity in the outcome. But that's kind of a separate discussion. The broader point, everything is connected. That's increasingly true. We have a well-established set of declaratory and escalatory policies, deterrent policies in the kinetic world. And we're in the early innings still of extending those into the digital world. So our adversaries do things to us using digital means that they would never do to us in the kinetic world because they know how we would respond. Yeah,
it's interesting because you probably see things happening all the time, and it also kind of shapes people's views of these countries as well, right? And it's it definitely it's sort of interesting because the public doesn't always get a chance to see what these sort of unsavory characters are doing.
Yeah, the one thing I would say, kind of a macro trend line, is I think the U.S. government is getting better and more comfortable and faster with the public release of information that may previously have remained classified. You saw it in the run-up to the war in Ukraine. Very rapid disclosures of things that went from highly classified to being talked about at the White House podium, in a day. And in order to make clear to the world what was happening. You've seen, just in the last few months, conversation in the press about foreign intelligence interference in the U.S. election in support of both candidates. I mean, countries and their intelligence services acting in order to pursue what they perceive to be their national interests. And it's happening all the time.
Is there any solution to that, do you think, or it's going to just continue to be more of a?
I mean, I think like with most things, there's a fair amount of sunlight policy that's good. Transparency is good. When the waves of Russian hybrid attacks in Eastern Europe right now, misinformation, disinformation, cyber attacks, kinetic attacks, make no mistake, moving buoys in rivers, border buoys, blowing up cars, lighting warehouses on fire. I mean, this stuff is all happening today. It's happening on a regular basis. And our kind of bedrock position is it's not going to work because we see it. We see it and we talk about it. And our allies see it and we talk about it. These things tend to only work when they can remain in the shadows.
Yeah, no, I think you and I talked about that article that, I think the idea of this, no one should be isolated, right? I think it's the dialogue seems to be, and I think one of the things that we love about this conference and what we do in Hawaii is we have an open dialogue, and I think I think it has to be done on every level. So as you start thinking about going into the next 2 years in terms of where do you see sort of expanding your roles? Is it going to be more? Will we see you more around the infrastructure space, and do you think it's going to be through the State Department, or do you think it's going to be through other areas? Or
so we just released a couple of months ago an updated U.S. international strategy for cyberspace and digital, and it has a few foundational pillars. One of them is we have to take a full ecosystem approach. We've been uneven in that in the past, I would say, and I hope that you're starting to see the U.S. and our allies and our partners in Europe and Asia engaging across kind of the full spectrum from cables to cloud. So I do think that we're gonna have to see a lot closer public-private engagement across the infrastructure space. I mean, this is it's a race that's being run right now. Generational investments. So once countries make these decisions, they're hard to unwind. In the near term, and that's going to include undersea cable, terrestrial fiber, data centers, and obviously a more well-established campaign that we've had for a long time on wireless telecom.
Yeah, it's a how does all of the agencies sort of work together too? Because I think one of the things, obviously, for many of at least from the overseas crowd that comes in. We've dealt with the FCC always has been sort of our single point of contact. We've also had to deal with Team Telecom, which is anytime there's mergers and acquisitions. Do you see all that kind of coalescing into sort of a way of being streamlined, or do you think it's still going to be kind of all these various groups that our folks have to deal with?
Yeah, unfortunately, and look, I was a CEO for a dozen years and was routinely hauled into government meetings and was continuously frustrated that I never had a single interlocutor, that I would say something to somebody and then I have to say the same thing to 5 other agencies, and the left hand never talked to the right hand, and now I'm part of the problem. And the reality, I think, is the U.S. government is a huge enterprise. I don't want to overpromise and say that we're moving to kind of more consolidated approach on these things, because I just think that it's going to be a little bit of both. And you asked earlier about in the wake of attacks, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, we set up the Department of Homeland Security. Is there going to be something that happens here now in this domain? I mean, it kind of has already happened. You've got an office of the National Cyber Director that is intended to be in the White House. That is intended to be the sort of quarterback on the field for the various agencies in the cyberspace. On the digital infrastructure side, I think we're trying to make the State Department a more central front door and player with companies, with partner governments around the world to do some of the coordination inside the U.S. government. I think that's what we've seen with this specific project is state taking a more assertive role because of the intrinsic diplomacy that has to happen with all of these large projects that cross international boundaries.
Well, Nate, thank you very much for coming. Ambassador Fick will come back this afternoon, so he will actually be. You get a chance to trade ideas with Vince Cerf, the one of the original internet protocol guys, and then obviously Gautam. So it'll be a very interesting discussion. And for those of you in the audience, please come back around 3:30, and it will be open to questions at that time. So Ambassador Fick will walk you through, and he'll be happy to engage on anything that comes across your minds. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot. Glad to be here.